In the wind-swept plains of Nebraska, beneath a blood-red sunset that painted the sky like a warning, a young woman stepped off the westbound train, clutching a worn leather suitcase and a letter that had promised her a new life. What Rebecca Matthews found waiting for her at the remote Whitmore homestead would shatter every expectation she'd carried across 3 states and force her to make a choice that would define not just her future, but the fate of 9 forgotten souls. This is the story of how one woman's desperate search for belonging became the salvation an entire family had been praying for, and how sometimes the greatest acts of love come from the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1889, and Rebecca Matthews sat rigid in the hard wooden seat of the Union Pacific Railroad car, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap as the endless Nebraska prairie rolled past her window. At 24, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that revealed itself slowly. Soft brown hair that caught golden highlights in sunlight, intelligent green eyes that missed nothing, and a determined set to her jaw that spoke of inner strength forged through years of hardship. The letter she'd read countless times during the 3-day journey from Philadelphia lay carefully folded in her reticule, its edges worn soft from handling. The penmanship had been educated and confident. The words painted a picture of comfort and companionship that seemed too good to be true for a woman in her circumstances. Dear Miss Matthews, your advertisement in the Philadelphia Gazette has caught my attention. I am Samuel Whitmore, age 32, owner of a successful cattle ranch in Cedar Valley, Nebraska. I seek a companion of good character and practical disposition to share in the management of my household, and God willing, to become my wife. I can offer you a comfortable home, financial security, and the respect due a woman of virtue. Should my proposal interest you, I await your reply with great anticipation. Rebecca's own circumstances had made Mr. Whitmore's offer irresistible. After her father's death from consumption the previous winter, she'd found herself alone in a Philadelphia boarding house, working 14-hour days in a textile mill for wages that barely covered her rent and meals. The other women whispered about girls who'd gone west as mail-order brides, some to happiness, others to heartbreak, but all to something better than the grey desperation of industrial poverty. Her correspondence with Samuel Whitmore had continued. For 4 months, his letters painting an increasingly appealing picture of life on a thriving ranch. He described morning coffee on a wide front porch, evening walks through fields of wheat, a community of neighbors who looked out for one another. Most importantly, he'd written about wanting children, lots of them, to fill a house that had known too much silence. Rebecca had grown up in a large family before typhoid fever claimed her parents and scattered her siblings to different relatives. The promise of recreating that warmth, that sense of belonging to something larger than herself, had proven more attractive than any material comfort Samuel might offer. The train whistle's mournful cry announced their approach to Cedar Valley as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Rebecca gathered her few possessions, the worn suitcase that had belonged to her mother, a small sewing basket, and a leather-bound volume of poetry that represented her one luxury. Everything she owned in the world could be carried in 2 hands, but she'd carried less before and survived. Cedar Valley's train depot was little more than a weathered wooden platform and a single-room station house that seemed to crouch against the endless sky like a child seeking shelter. A handful of buildings clustered around what optimistically called itself Main Street, their false fronts and unpainted siding, speaking of a community still scratching its existence from stubborn soil. Rebecca stepped onto the platform, her city, dress and proper traveling hat, marking her immediately as an outsider among the handful of locals who'd gathered to meet the train. She searched the faces for someone matching Samuel's description, tall, broad-shouldered with dark hair and kind eyes, but found only weathered farmers and curious children staring at the unusual sight of a well-dressed woman arriving alone. Minutes passed as other passengers departed and the depot emptied. The station master, a thin man with prematurely grey hair, approached her with obvious concern. "Miss, you waiting for someone? Train's not due back through until Thursday." "I'm Rebecca Matthews," she replied, trying to keep uncertainty from her voice. "I'm meeting Samuel Whitmore. He owns a ranch outside town." The station master's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been pity or discomfort. He removed his cap, running nervous fingers through his thinning hair. "Miss Matthews, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Samuel Whitmore, well, he passed on near 2 months ago. Took fever after helping fight a prairie fire. Most everyone in these parts knew about it." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her careful plans, her hopes for a new beginning, her escape from Philadelphia's grinding poverty, all of it crumbled in an instant. She'd spent her last dollars on train fare, burning bridges behind her with the confidence of someone who believed they were moving towards something better. "But his letters," she whispered, more to herself than to the station master. "He wrote, 'To me just 3 weeks ago.' Letters." The man's confusion was genuine. "Miss, Samuel never married, never had much truck with correspondence. Lived alone out at the old Whitmore place since his brother died. You sure you got the right name?" Before Rebecca could respond, a small voice piped up from behind a stack of grain sacks. "She's the lady Papa Samuel said was coming." A boy emerged. From his hiding place, perhaps 8 years old, with sandy hair that stuck up at odd angles and clothes that were clean but patched in multiple places. His blue eyes held an intelligence far beyond his years, along with something that might have been hope. "Tommy Whitmore," the station master said with obvious relief. "What are you doing here, son? And what's this about your papa writing letters?" Tommy glanced nervously between the adults, clearly weighing how much truth he dared reveal. "Papa Samuel got real sick before he died. He was worried about us, about what would happen. He said he'd found someone who might help." The station master's expression grew troubled. "Tommy, where are your brothers and sisters? Mrs. Henderson was supposed to be looking after you all until the territorial authorities could make proper arrangements." "Mrs. Henderson got the influenza last week," Tommy replied matter-of-factly. "Had to go stay with her daughter in Lincoln. We've been managing fine on our own." Rebecca's mind raced as she began to understand the true situation. Samuel Whitmore had indeed written to her, but not as a prospective husband seeking a bride. He'd been a dying man, desperate to secure care for children who would otherwise face separation and uncertain futures in overcrowded orphanages. "How many of you are there?" she asked gently, kneeling to meet Tommy's eyes. "9, he replied with the matter-of-fact delivery of a child, accustomed to being responsible beyond his years. "Well, 8 now that Papa Samuel's gone. But Mary's only 3, and the twins just turned 5, and baby Catherine needs lots of care and—" "Tommy," the station master interrupted, his voice heavy with the weight of adult responsibility. "You children can't continue living alone. It's not safe and it's not legal. The territorial authorities will have to place you in institutions until proper families can be found." The boy's composure finally cracked, revealing the frightened child beneath his premature maturity. "No, we belong together. Papa Samuel promised we'd never be split up. He said the lady would understand, would help us stay together." Rebecca looked at this earnest boy, pleading for his family's survival, and felt something shift inside her chest. She'd come west, seeking personal salvation, but perhaps she'd found something more important, a chance to provide salvation for others. The practical voice in her head catalogued the impossibilities. She had no money, no home, no legal standing to care for someone else's children. She knew nothing about raising children, especially not 9 of them, ranging from babies to near adolescence. The entire situation was precisely the kind of disaster any sensible woman would flee from immediately. But Rebecca Matthews had never been entirely sensible, and she'd certainly never been one to abandon those who needed help. "Where is this ranch?" she asked quietly. "Where are the other children?" Tommy's face lit up with desperate hope. "About 5 miles north." "But miss, it's getting dark, and the road's not good for walking." The station master cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Matthews, I feel obliged to point out that this situation is highly irregular. These children need proper care from established families, not someone who's essentially a stranger herself." Rebecca understood his concerns, shared them even, but something in Tommy's eyes reminded her of her own desperation when she'd first answered Samuel's advertisement. Sometimes desperate situations require desperate solutions, and sometimes the most unlikely people proved capable of extraordinary things. "Can you arrange transportation to the ranch?" she asked. "I'd like to meet the other children before making any decisions." As the sun set behind them, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca found herself in a borrowed wagon with Tommy as her guide, traveling toward a future she'd never imagined. The boy chattered nervously as they bumped along the rutted road, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to prepare her for what awaited. "Sarah's 11, she's real good with the little ones. And Michael's 9, he's good with animals. The twins are Lucy and Laura, they're 5, and they're real quiet most times. David's 7, he helps with chores. Emma's 4, she follows Sarah everywhere. Mary's 3, she still has accidents sometimes. And baby Catherine's not even walking yet, but she smiles all the time." Rebecca tried to memorize the names and ages, already feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what she was walking into. 9 children. 9 individual personalities, needs, fears, and dreams. 9 reasons why this situation was impossible, and 9 reasons why walking away might be the cruelest thing she could do. The Whitmore homestead appeared as they crested a low hill, its buildings silhouetted against the darkening sky like something from a frontier painting. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure with a wide porch that spoke of better times. Outbuildings clustered around it, a barn, chicken coop, and various sheds that suggested this had once been a working ranch. But even in the gathering darkness, Rebecca could see signs of recent neglect. Fence rails sagged, the porch steps needed repair, and several windows showed the telltale reflection of boards rather than glass. This was a place struggling to maintain itself, much like the children who called it home. Light flickered in the windows, and as their wagon approached, the front door opened to reveal a small girl with braided hair and a flour-dusted apron. This had to be Sarah, the 11-year-old Tommy had described as real good with the little ones. "Tommy," Sarah called out with obvious relief, "I was worried when you didn't come back before dark. Did you—" She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed Rebecca, her expression shifting from relief to uncertainty. "Sarah, this is Miss Matthews," Tommy announced proudly. "She's the lady Papa Samuel wrote to. She came on the train just like he said she would." Sarah's eyes widened as she studied Rebecca's traveling dress and proper city appearance. The girl possessed an old soul that seemed to weigh and measure everything she encountered, probably a necessity when caring for 8 younger siblings. "You really came," Sarah whispered, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might make Rebecca disappear like a mirage. As Rebecca stepped down from the wagon, children began appearing from various parts of the house. A boy with serious dark eyes who must be Michael, twin girls who clung to each other shyly, a gap-toothed boy grinning widely. David, she guessed. They arranged themselves on the porch like a receiving line, their faces showing mixtures of hope, fear, and desperate longing. The youngest ones hung back, partially hidden behind their older siblings, but Rebecca could see them peeking out with the wide-eyed curiosity of children encountering something unprecedented. In the doorway, Sarah held a baby on her hip, Catherine, the infant Tommy had mentioned. "Children," Sarah said with the authority of someone forced to grow up too fast. "This is Miss Matthews. She's come to see about us." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and impossible hopes. These children had learned not to expect too much from adults, had probably seen too many promises broken, and too many people walk away when faced with the reality of their situation. Rebecca looked at their faces, earnest, hopeful, frightened, resigned, and realized that whatever decision she made in the next few minutes would alter the course of 9 lives forever. She'd come west seeking her own salvation, but instead she'd found something far more challenging and potentially far more rewarding. The weight of their collective gaze settled on her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility she'd never asked for, but somehow felt destined to carry. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior of the Whitmore house revealed the true scope of what 9 children had been attempting to manage alone. Rebecca followed Sarah through the front door into a living room that told the story of desperate survival disguised as domestic normalcy. Furniture had been pushed against walls to create more floor space, where blankets and pillows suggested makeshift sleeping arrangements for the younger children. The smell of something burning drifted from the kitchen, accompanied by the sound of a baby's persistent crying. "Oh no, the cornbread," Sarah exclaimed, thrusting baby Catherine into Rebecca's arms before rushing toward the kitchen. The infant immediately began wailing louder, her tiny fists flailing as she protested being handed to a stranger. Rebecca found herself holding a baby for the first time in her life, the child's weight both lighter and more substantial than she'd expected. Catherine's cries seemed to pierce straight through her skull, and Rebecca's instinctive rocking motion only intensified the infant's distress. "She don't like new people much," Michael observed matter-of-factly from the doorway. At 9 years old, he possessed the stoic demeanor of someone who'd learned to accept life's disappointments without complaint. "Been fussy ever since Mrs. Henderson left. Sarah's been trying to keep her fed, but we ain't got much milk left." The twins, Lucy and Laura, appeared from behind the staircase, their identical faces studying Rebecca with the unblinking intensity that only 5-year-olds could manage. They wore matching dresses that had been carefully mended multiple times, their dark hair braided with the imperfect precision of a child's hands. "Are you going to be our new mama?" Lucy asked with devastating directness. "Lucy?" Sarah's voice carried sharp embarrassment as she returned from the kitchen, carrying a pan of thoroughly blackened cornbread. "I told you not to ask personal questions, but Tommy said she came to marry Papa Samuel," Laura added, her small voice carrying confusion. "Only Papa Samuel's in the ground now, so what's she gonna do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the ruined cornbread. Rebecca looked around the room at 8 pairs of eyes, 9 counting baby Catherine, who had finally stopped crying and was now studying Rebecca's face with that peculiar intensity infants possessed. David, the 7-year-old with the gap-toothed grin, stepped forward with the kind of boldness that suggested he was accustomed to being the family's ambassador to the adult world. "Miss, are you hungry? Sarah made stew, and it's real good. Better than what Mrs. Henderson used to make, even though Sarah says we shouldn't speak ill of folks who tried to help." Emma, a serious 4-year-old with her older sister's dark eyes, tugged on Rebecca's skirt with sticky fingers. "The stew's got carrots in it. I don't like carrots, but Sarah says we got to eat what we got." "Emma, mind your manners," Sarah scolded gently, then turned to Rebecca with an expression that mixed pride and desperation "I'm sorry about the cornbread, Miss Matthews. I was watching the little ones and forgot about the oven. There's still stew, though, and we got some biscuits from yesterday that aren't too hard." Rebecca shifted Catherine to her shoulder, surprised, when the infant settled against her with a contented sigh. The baby's warmth and weight created an unexpected sense of rightness, as if some dormant maternal instinct was awakening within her. "Please, call me Rebecca," she said gently, "and I'd be grateful for some stew. It's been a long journey." They saw children's faces brightened noticeably at her acceptance of their hospitality. Sarah bustled back toward the kitchen, her relief evident in the quickening of her movements. Tommy and Michael began setting the table with the careful precision of children who'd learned that proper presentation might make their meager meals seem more substantial. As Rebecca surveyed the dining room, she began to notice details that spoke of recent loss and desperate adaptation. A man's coat still hung on a peg by the door, its shoulders bearing the shape of someone who would never wear it again. Children's drawings covered one wall, some clearly older and more sophisticated, probably Sarah's work, while others showed the primitive charm of much younger artists. The dining table, which might once have hosted prosperous ranch dinners, was now set with a mismatched collection of plates and cups that suggested careful rationing of their remaining dishes. Several chairs had been pushed aside, probably too large for the smaller children to manage comfortably. "Where's Mary?" Rebecca asked, realizing she'd only met 8 of the 9 children Tommy had mentioned. "Under the table," David announced cheerfully, then called toward the dining room. "Mary, come meet the lady." A tiny face appeared from beneath the tablecloth, framed by tangled blonde curls and marked by what looked like jam stains around the mouth. Mary, the 3-year-old, studied Rebecca with the serious consideration of someone deciding whether this new person represented opportunity or threat. "She's been hiding more since Mrs. Henderson left," Sarah explained, as she returned with a steaming bowl of stew. "Gets scared when strangers come around. Last week, Mr. Peterson from the bank came by asking questions, and she hid in the root cellar for 3 hours. The mention of the bank sent a chill through Rebecca's chest. Bank representatives didn't make social calls to isolated ranches, especially not when asking questions about orphaned children. The implications were clear enough. The Whitmore Ranch was facing financial difficulties that would complicate any attempt to keep the family together. Mary eventually emerged from under the table, approaching Rebecca with the cautious sideways movement of a cat investigating something unfamiliar. She stopped just beyond arm's reach, her thumb finding its way to her mouth as she continued her assessment. "Pretty lady," Mary whispered around her thumb, the words barely audible. "Thank you, sweetheart," Rebecca replied softly, then addressed the group. "Sarah, this stew is wonderful. You're clearly very talented in the kitchen." Sarah's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "Mama taught me before she passed. Said a woman needed to know how to feed her family proper, no matter what circumstances she found herself in." "When did you lose your parents?" Rebecca asked gently, realizing she still knew very little about how these children had come to be. "In Samuel Whitmore's care." The children exchanged glances, and Rebecca sensed she'd touched on a painful topic that required careful navigation. Tommy, as the apparent family spokesman, took the responsibility of explanation. "Mama and Papa died in the diphtheria outbreak 3 winters ago," he said matter-of-factly. "Lots of folks died that winter. Papa Samuel, he was Mama's brother, and he came to take us in when nobody else would take all of us together." Michael nodded solemnly. "Other folks wanted just 1 or 2 of us, the babies mostly, but Papa Samuel said families belong together, even when they ain't born to the same parents. He used to tell us stories about when him and Mama were little," Sarah added, her voice taking on the reverent tone children used when speaking of beloved memories. "How they stuck together through hard times, looked out for each other. He said, "That's what family does." The picture that emerged painted Samuel Whitmore as a man who'd sacrificed his own comfort to preserve a family unit that others had been willing to split apart for convenience. His decision to take in 8 orphaned children had undoubtedly strained his resources and complicated his life enormously. Rebecca began to understand why he might have reached out to a mail-order bride service in his final weeks. Not seeking romance or companionship, but desperately searching for someone who might continue his mission of keeping these children together. "Tell me about the ranch," Rebecca said, accepting a second helping of stew that she didn't particularly want but sensed would please her young hosts. "What kind of work were you and Samuel doing here?" "Cattle, mostly," Michael replied with obvious pride. "Papa Samuel taught me how to read their moods, how to tell when they're fixing to cause trouble. We got about 40 head left, though some might have wandered off since Papa Samuel got sick." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "And chickens. Sarah takes real good care of the chickens. We get eggs most every day, and sometimes we can trade eggs to Mrs. Johnson for flour and sugar. There's a vegetable garden too," Sarah added, "though it needs work. I tried to keep it going, but with watching the little ones and doing the cooking and cleaning." Her voice trailed off, and Rebecca heard the exhaustion of a child carrying responsibilities far beyond her years. Emma climbed onto the chair beside Rebecca, her small hands carefully arranging her napkin in her lap with the precision of someone trying very hard to demonstrate good manners. "Do you know how to milk cows?" Emma asked seriously. "Sarah tries, but Bessie don't like her much, kicks over the bucket sometimes." "I've never milked a cow," Rebecca admitted, earning wide-eyed stares from several of the children. In their rural world, such ignorance probably seemed as impossible as not knowing how to breathe. "We could teach you," David offered generously. "It ain't too hard once you get the hang of it. Just gotta be gentle and talk nice to Bessie so she knows you're friendly." As the meal continued, Rebecca found herself drawn into the family's rhythms. Despite the impossibility of her situation, the children's easy acceptance of her presence, their willingness to share their meager resources, their obvious affection for each other, all of it created an atmosphere of warmth that had been absent from her life for years, but practical concerns pressed against the emotional appeal of the moment. These children faced real dangers beyond simple poverty. Without legal guardianship, they could be separated and placed in institutions at any time. The ranch clearly needed significant work and investment to remain viable. Most critically, Rebecca had no legal standing, no resources, and no experience to justify taking responsibility for 9 young lives. After dinner, Sarah began organizing the evening routine with the efficiency of a seasoned mother. The older children helped clear dishes, while the younger ones were directed toward washing and preparing for bed. Rebecca found herself assigned baby Catherine again, this time with instructions to just walk her around the living room until she gets sleepy. The infant seemed more comfortable with Rebecca now, her tiny fingers grasping at the buttons on Rebecca's traveling dress while she babbled contentedly. The weight of the child in her arms felt increasingly natural, and Rebecca discovered an unexpected talent for the gentle, swaying motion that seemed to soothe Catherine's occasional fussiness. "She likes you," Mary observed, having emerged from her earlier shyness to hover nearby. "She cries when Mr. Peterson holds her." "Mr. Peterson has held her?" Rebecca asked, feeling a renewed surge of concern about the bank representative's involvement. "With the children. He came last week with papers," Tommy explained, his voice losing some of its earlier enthusiasm. "Said he needed to know about the ranch's finances, about who was responsible for us now that Papa Samuel's gone." Sarah's expression darkened as she supervised the twins' bedtime preparations. "He asked a lot of questions about whether we had any other family, anyone who might take us in. When we said no, he got that look adults get when they're fixing to make decisions for children. The implications were clear enough. The bank was positioning itself to foreclose on the ranch, and the territorial authorities were preparing to remove the children to institutional care. Time was running out for any chance of preserving the family unit that Samuel Whitmore had died trying to protect. As the evening progressed, Rebecca witnessed the elaborate choreography required to settle 9 children for the night in a house. Designed for a much smaller family, the older children shared bedrooms upstairs, while the younger ones slept in the living room under Sarah's watchful supervision. Everyone had specific roles and responsibilities, from Tommy's job of checking that all doors were locked to Emma's duty of ensuring Mary used the chamber pot before bed. The efficiency of their routine spoke of months of practice of children who'd learned to function as a family unit despite the absence of adult supervision. But Rebecca also noticed the signs of strain: Sarah's exhausted sighs when she thought no one was watching, Michael's premature seriousness as he discussed adult concerns, the way even the youngest children seemed to understand that their situation was precarious. When the last child had been settled and the house finally grew quiet, Rebecca found herself alone with Sarah in the kitchen, helping to wash the evening's dishes by lamplight. "Miss Rebecca," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of responsibilities no 11-year-old should bear. "I know this isn't what you expected when you came here, and I know we're asking too much, expecting too much, but we don't have anybody else." Rebecca dried a chipped plate slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah, what you've accomplished here, taking care of your brothers and sisters, keeping everyone fed and safe, it's remarkable. You should be proud of yourself." "But I can't keep doing it forever," Sarah replied, with devastating honesty. "I'm not strong enough to milk Bessie Reliable, not smart enough to handle the bank people, not old enough to make them take us serious. And the little ones, they need more than I can give them." The girls' tears came silently, the kind of crying that children learned when they couldn't afford to let their younger siblings see their fear. Rebecca set down her dish towel and pulled Sarah into a gentle embrace, feeling the child's thin shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. "You've done more than anyone could ask," Rebecca whispered, "more than most adults could manage. But you're right that you shouldn't have to carry this burden alone." As she held this brave girl who'd been forced to grow up too fast, Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest. The practical objections to staying, lack of money, legal complications, her own inexperience, remained as valid as ever. But the moral objection to leaving had become impossible to ignore. These children needed more than institutional care or separation into different families. They needed someone willing to fight for them, to preserve the bonds that Samuel Whitmore had died protecting, someone willing to risk everything on the chance that love and determination might triumph over impossible circumstances. Outside, the Nebraska wind howled across the prairie with the voice of winter approaching, and Rebecca realized she was facing the most important decision of her life. Dawn arrived with the harsh reality of a Nebraska winter threatening on the horizon. Rebecca had spent the night on Samuel Whitmore's narrow bed, the only proper sleeping accommodation the children had. Insisted she take, while they maintained their usual arrangements throughout the house. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through the impossible mathematics of her situation. 9 children, no money, no legal authority, and a community that would soon demand answers she didn't have. The sound of hushed voices and careful footsteps drifted up from the kitchen, where Sarah was already preparing breakfast with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to starting each day before sunrise. Rebecca dressed quickly in yesterday's travel clothes, acutely aware that her city attire marked her as an outsider in this world of practical necessities and rural survival. Downstairs, she found the morning routine already in full swing. Michael had returned from milking duties with a partially filled pail, evidence of Bessie's continued resistance to his inexperienced hands. Tommy was helping the twins dress, while David entertained baby Catherine with elaborate facial expressions that sent her into delighted giggles. Emma sat at the kitchen table, carefully practicing her letters on a slate board, with the concentrated determination of a child who understood that education was a privilege not to be wasted. "Good morning, Miss Rebecca," Sarah called softly, not wanting to wake Mary, who was still curled on a blanket near the stove. "I made oatmeal with some preserves Mrs. Johnson gave us last week. Coffee's fresh too." Rebecca accepted the steaming cup gratefully, noting how Sarah had clearly given her the best china cup while the children used chipped ceramic mugs. The coffee was weak but hot, and the oatmeal had been stretched with water to ensure there was enough for everyone, another indication of how carefully the family managed their dwindling resources. "Sarah, we need to discuss something important," Rebecca said gently, settling at the table where several of the older children could hear. "About Mr. Peterson and the bank. What exactly did he tell you during his visit?" The children exchanged those quick glances that spoke of shared knowledge they weren't certain they should reveal to an adult. Tommy finally took the burden of explanation, his 8-year-old voice attempting the serious tone of someone delivering important information. "He said the ranch owes money, lots of money. Papa Samuel borrowed against the land to pay for medical bills when folks got sick, and to buy supplies during the bad winter 2 years ago. Mr. Peterson said if nobody can pay what's owed, the bank has to take the ranch back." Michael nodded grimly. "And he said children can't own property legal-like. So even if Papa Samuel left us the ranch in his will, it don't matter 'cause we're too young." "Did Samuel leave a will?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected the answer wouldn't provide the hope the children clearly harbored. "He wrote something down before he died," Sarah replied, retrieving a folded paper from a tin box on the kitchen shelf. "But Mrs. Henderson said it might not be proper legal, since it wasn't done by a real lawyer." Rebecca examined the document, written in Samuel's increasingly shaky handwriting as his illness progressed. The intent was clear. He wanted the ranch and all his possessions to go to the 8 children he'd cared for, with the oldest, Sarah, to serve as their guardian until they reached majority. But the informal language and lack of proper witnesses would likely make it legally meaningless in any territorial court. More troubling was a notation at the bottom of the page, in different handwriting. "Outstanding debt to Cedar Valley Bank. $847.50. Monthly payment $15 due first of each month." Rebecca's heart sank as she calculated the implications. Even if the will were legally valid, the children owed the bank nearly $900, more money than a struggling ranch could generate in years, especially without experienced adult management. The monthly payments alone exceeded what the children could earn through their modest egg sales and occasional trading. "When is the next payment due?" Rebecca asked, though she dreaded the answer. "November 1st, Tommy replied, "day after tomorrow." The timeline was even worse than Rebecca had feared. In just over 24 hours, the bank would have legal grounds to begin foreclosure proceedings. Once that process started, the territorial authorities would almost certainly intervene to remove the children from what they'd classify as an unstable situation. As if summoned by their conversation about official intervention, the sound of an approaching wagon drew everyone's attention to the front windows. A well-dressed man in a dark suit was climbing down from a hired buggy, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the expression of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Mr. Peterson," Sarah whispered, her face draining of color. Rebecca felt her stomach clench as she realized their discussion time had just run out. Whatever decisions needed to be made would have to be made now, in the face of immediate crisis, rather than careful consideration. "Children, I want you to continue with breakfast," Rebecca said with a calm authority that surprised her. "Sarah, please answer the door and invite Mr. Peterson in for coffee. Be polite, but don't volunteer any information beyond what he specifically asks. The banker proved to be a thin man in his 50s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his days behind a desk, and the nervous energy of someone uncomfortable with the personal aspects of his professional duties. He accepted Sarah's offer of coffee, but remained standing in the living room, his eyes cataloguing the evidence of children living without proper adult supervision. "Miss," he began, clearly uncertain how to address Rebecca. "Matthews." Rebecca. Matthews. She offered no further explanation of her presence, following her own advice about volunteering information. "Mr. Peterson, Cedar Valley Bank," he replied with obvious relief at having an adult to address. "I'm here regarding the outstanding debt on this property and the irregular situation regarding these children's care." Rebecca's mind raced through possible responses. She had no legal standing to speak for the children, no authority to negotiate on their behalf. But she also recognized that the next few minutes might determine whether this family stayed together or was scattered to institutions across the territory. "I understand there are financial obligations involved," Rebecca said carefully. "Perhaps you could explain the bank's position clearly so we can discuss possible solutions." Peterson opened his satchel and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "The Whitmore Ranch currently owes $847.50 in principal and accumulated interest. Samuel Whitmore had been meeting his monthly obligations until his final illness, but the payment, due November 1st, will be the first missed payment since the loan was established." "And what are the bank's options if that payment isn't made?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately," Peterson replied matter-of-factly. "The property would be seized and sold to recover the outstanding debt. Any proceeds beyond what's owed would theoretically go to the estate, but given that the presumed heirs are minors without legal guardians—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Any money would disappear into legal fees and administrative costs, leaving the children with nothing." Tommy stepped forward with the kind of desperate courage that children sometimes displayed when facing the destruction of everything they held dear. "Mr. Peterson, what if we could make the payment? What if we could find the $15 somehow?" The banker's expression softened slightly, revealing genuine sympathy beneath his professional demeanor. "Son, even if you could manage this month's payment, you'd face the same problem next month and the month after that. And beyond the debt payments, this ranch needs significant investment to remain viable. The roof needs repair, several fence lines need rebuilding, and the cattle herd has been depleted to unsustainable levels." Rebecca felt the weight of mathematical reality crushing down on them. Even if some miracle provided enough money to satisfy the bank's immediate demands, the long-term prospects were nearly hopeless. The ranch required more investment than the children could possibly generate, and their situation would only become more precarious as winter approached. But as she looked at the children's faces, Sarah's desperate determination, Tommy's stubborn hope, Michael's premature understanding of adult failures, Rebecca realized that mathematical impossibility might not be the most important factor in her decision. "Mr. Peterson," she said quietly, "what would happen if these children had a legal guardian, someone who could take responsibility for the debt and the ranch's management?" The banker's eyebrows rose with interest. "Well, that would change the situation considerably. A competent adult guardian with resources or credible plans for managing the debt could potentially negotiate more favorable terms. The bank's primary concern is recovering its investment, not displacing families unnecessarily. And the children would be allowed to remain together? Certainly, assuming their guardian could demonstrate the ability to provide proper care and supervision." Rebecca felt 9 pairs of eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to burn through her chest. She was being offered a chance to save this family, but at the cost of assuming responsibilities that could destroy her own life. If she failed, the practical voice in her head catalogued all the reasons why guardianship was impossible. She had no money to make debt payments, no experience managing a ranch, no legal right to commit to obligations she couldn't fulfill. She would be signing on to care for 9 children while somehow generating enough income to satisfy a bank debt, and that had already proven unsustainable. But the voice of her heart spoke in Sarah's exhausted sighs, in baby Catherine's trusting weight against her shoulder, in the twins' innocent questions about whether she would be their new mama. These children had already lost too much. Parents, security, hope. They deserved someone willing to fight for them, even against impossible odds. I would need to understand the exact legal requirements for guardianship, Rebecca said slowly, the words feeling like a commitment even as she spoke them. Peterson's relief was evident. I could arrange for you to meet with Judge Harrison in town. He handles all guardianship proceedings in this county, and he's sympathetic to keeping families together when possible. As the banker prepared to leave, promising to delay any foreclosure action until Rebecca could meet with the judge, the children remained frozen in place, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile possibility of salvation. After Peterson's buggy disappeared down the rutted road, Rebecca found herself surrounded by 9 children whose faces showed a mixture of hope and terror. They understood, perhaps better than she did, exactly what she was considering sacrificing for their sake. "Miss Rebecca," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the windows. "You don't have to do this for us. We know. It's asking too much." Rebecca knelt to meet Sarah's eyes, then gathered as many of the children as she could reach into a collective embrace. Baby Catherine babbled contentedly from Emma's arms, while Mary finally emerged completely from her. Shyness to pat Rebecca's cheek with sticky fingers. "Sometimes," Rebecca said softly, "the most important decisions aren't about what we can afford to do, but about what we can't afford not to do." As the children absorbed her words, Rebecca realized she'd just committed herself to the greatest gamble of her life. She would fight for legal guardianship of 9 orphaned children, assume responsibility for a debt she couldn't pay, and attempt to save a ranch she didn't know how to manage. The odds of success were negligible, the chances of failure overwhelming. But looking at the faces surrounding her, hopeful, frightened, trusting, Rebecca understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the probability of victory. Tomorrow, she would ride into Cedar Valley and petition Judge Harrison for guardianship. Tonight, she would hold these children close and pray that love might prove stronger than mathematics, that determination might triumph over impossibility. The wind howled across the prairie with the voice of winter approaching, but inside the Whitmore house, 9 children slept more peacefully than they had in months. For the first time since Samuel's death, they faced the future with someone willing to stand between them and the forces that would tear their family apart. Whether Rebecca Matthews possessed the strength to honor that commitment remained to be seen, but her willingness to try had already transformed her from a stranger seeking her own salvation into the guardian angel these children had been praying for. The courthouse in Cedar Valley stood like a monument to territorial authority. Its red brick facade and imposing clock tower designed to remind citizens that the law's reach extended even to the most remote corners of Nebraska. Rebecca climbed the stone steps with trembling hands, clutching a worn leather portfolio containing what little documentation she possessed. Her identification papers, character references from Philadelphia, and Samuel Whitmore's informal will behind. Sarah held baby Catherine, while the other children arranged themselves in a nervous cluster on the courthouse lawn. Rebecca had insisted they all come, understanding that Judge Harrison needed to see the family unit she was fighting to preserve. The children had dressed in their best clothes, which meant carefully mended garments and shoes that had been polished, to hide their worn condition. Inside the courthouse, a clerk with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles examined Rebecca's petition with the skeptical expression of someone who'd seen countless desperate requests cross his desk. "Miss Matthews, you understand that guardianship proceedings are quite serious. You'd be assuming legal responsibility for 9 minor children, including financial obligations, and ensuring their proper education and moral development." "I understand." "The gravity of the situation," Rebecca replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "These children have already lost too much. They deserve a chance to remain together." The clerk's expression softened slightly. "Judge Harrison will see you in 10 minutes. He's a fair man, but he's also practical. You'll need to demonstrate not just good intentions, but realistic plans for supporting 9 children." As Rebecca waited in the austere hallway, she reviewed the arguments she'd prepared during the sleepless night. She would emphasize her educational background, her willingness to work, the children's obvious affection for each other. What she couldn't emphasize was her complete lack of financial resources or experience with ranch management, details that would likely prove decisive in the judge's ruling. Judge Harrison's chambers reflected a man who valued substance over ceremony. Law books lined every wall, and his desk was covered with carefully organized stacks of legal documents. The judge himself was younger than Rebecca had expected, perhaps 45, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that suggested he'd seen enough human suffering to appreciate the difference between genuine need and opportunistic deception. "Miss Matthews," he began without preamble, "Mr. Peterson has explained the situation regarding the Whitmore children and their financial circumstances. I understand you're seeking emergency guardianship?" "Yes, Your Honor. These children have been caring for themselves since Mrs. Henderson became ill, and they've done remarkably well. But they need legal protection to remain together." Judge Harrison opened a thick file folder, his expression growing more serious as he reviewed its contents. "I've been following this case since Samuel Whitmore's death. 8 orphaned children, significant debt, a ranch that requires substantial investment to remain viable. The territorial authorities have recommended institutional placement for the children's own protection." Rebecca felt her heart sink, but forced herself to continue. "Your Honor, these children aren't just siblings by blood. They're a family by choice and necessity. Separating them would cause trauma far worse than any temporary hardship they might face together. Miss Matthews, with respect, temporary hardship isn't the issue here. This ranch owes nearly $900 to the bank, with monthly payments that exceed any realistic income the property could generate. Even if I granted guardianship, you'd face foreclosure within months, leaving these children homeless as well as orphaned." The judge's assessment was devastatingly accurate, but Rebecca had anticipated this challenge. "Your Honor, I've given considerable thought to the financial aspects. I have skills that could generate income. I can teach, take in sewing, perhaps establish a small school for local children. The ranch itself has potential if properly managed." Judge Harrison's skeptical expression suggested he'd heard similar optimistic projections from other desperate petitioners. "Miss Matthews, do you have any experience with cattle ranching, agricultural management, financial planning for large families?" "No, Your Honor," Rebecca admitted, understanding that honesty served better than false claims. "But I have something, perhaps more important, the determination to learn whatever skills are necessary to keep this family together." Before the judge could respond, a commotion outside his chambers drew their attention. Raised voices in the hallway suggested some kind of disagreement, and Rebecca's heart clenched with fear that something had happened to the children waiting on the courthouse lawn. The chamber door opened to admit Mr. Peterson, followed by a woman Rebecca didn't recognize, an imposing figure in expensive traveling clothes whose bearing suggested both authority and barely contained anger. Your Honor, Peterson began apologetically, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mrs. Abernathy has just arrived from Omaha with information relevant to these proceedings. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose with interest. Mrs. Victoria Abernathy, I wasn't expecting you until next week's Territorial Council meeting. The woman stepped forward with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having her opinions carry weight in official proceedings. Judge Harrison, I came as soon as I heard about this guardianship petition. The territorial authorities have already made arrangements for these children's proper placement in established institutions. Rebecca felt the room's atmosphere shift, as Mrs. Abernathy's presence added a new dynamic to the proceedings. Clearly, this woman possessed influence that could override local judicial decisions, and her obvious opposition to Rebecca's petition represented a threat far more serious than simple financial concerns. Mrs. Abernathy serves on the territorial board overseeing child welfare, Judge Harrison explained to Rebecca. Her recommendations carry considerable weight in guardianship proceedings. Mrs. Abernathy opened her own leather portfolio, withdrawing documents with the efficiency of someone who'd conducted similar interventions many times before. Judge Harrison, I've reviewed the case files regarding these children. 9 minors without proper supervision, living in poverty on a failing ranch, with no realistic prospects for improvement. The Nebraska Children's Home in Omaha has agreed to accept all 9 children, ensuring they receive proper education, medical care, and moral guidance. Together? Rebecca asked sharply, dreading the answer. Mrs. Abernathy's expression revealed her impatience with such sentimental concerns. Miss Matthews, institutional placement decisions are made based on practical considerations, available space, age-appropriate groupings, specialized needs. While we make every effort to keep siblings together when possible, the welfare of individual children takes precedence over maintaining family units that may not be in their best interests. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality. The children would be separated, possibly permanently. The older ones might be placed together, but the younger children would likely be distributed among different institutions or families based on availability rather than their emotional bonds. Your Honor, Rebecca said desperately, these children have already suffered the trauma of losing their parents. Separating them from each other would compound that trauma unnecessarily. Mrs. Abernathy's response carried the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions for other people's benefit. Miss Matthews, emotional attachment cannot override practical necessities. These children need stability, education, and proper supervision. A single woman with no resources and no experience cannot provide what 9 children require. Judge Harrison studied the documents Mrs. Abernathy had provided, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Rebecca could see her chances of guardianship approval evaporating as the territorial authorities' position became clear. But before the judge could render his decision, another interruption drew everyone's attention to the chamber windows. Outside, a crowd was gathering on the courthouse lawn, and Rebecca could see Sarah holding baby Catherine while trying to manage the other children's obvious distress. "It appears your charges are attracting attention," Mrs. Abernathy observed disapprovingly. Another indication that this situation has become unsuitable for children's welfare. Judge Harrison moved to the window, his expression changing as he observed the scene below. What Mrs. Abernathy had interpreted as chaos was actually something quite different. Townsfolk gathering around the children, offering comfort and support. Mrs. Johnson, the woman who'd been trading eggs with Sarah, was distributing sandwiches to the children. Dr. Williams, Cedar Valley's physician, was examining baby Catherine with obvious concern for her well-being. Even Mr. Peterson's own wife had joined the gathering, engaging in animated conversation with Sarah about the family's situation. "Judge Harrison," Rebecca said quietly, recognizing an opportunity to shift the conversation's direction. Perhaps we should hear from the children themselves. They're old enough to express their own preferences about their future. Mrs. Abernathy's immediate objection revealed her understanding of how such testimony might affect the proceedings. Your Honor, children cannot be expected to make rational decisions about their own welfare. They lack the maturity to understand long-term consequences. But Judge Harrison was already moving toward the door. Actually, Mrs. Abernathy, territorial. Law requires that children over 8 years of age be given the opportunity to express their preferences in guardianship proceedings. I think we should hear what these children have to say. The next 30 minutes proved to be the most emotionally charged period of Rebecca's life. In the courthouse's main chamber, each of the older children was given the opportunity to address the judge directly, while the younger ones sat in the gallery with various townspeople who'd volunteered to provide support. Tommy spoke first, his 8-year-old voice carrying far more gravity than should have been possible at his age. Your Honor, we know Miss Rebecca don't have much money, and we know the ranch is in trouble. But she came when nobody else would come. She didn't run away when she saw how many of us there were, or how much trouble we're in. Sarah's testimony proved even more compelling. At 11, she possessed the maturity to understand the legal implications while retaining the emotional honesty that adults often lost. Your Honor, I know how to take care of my brothers and sisters. I've been doing it since Mama and Papa died, but I can't protect them from banks and government people who want to split us up. Miss Rebecca can do that if you'll let her. Michael's contribution focused on practical considerations. Judge Harrison, we got 40 head of cattle and about 60 chickens. The garden produced enough vegetables last summer to feed us and trade. For other supplies, with proper help, this ranch could support our family, but it was Mary, the 3-year-old, who provided the most devastating testimony. When Judge Harrison gently asked what she wanted most, her answer was delivered with the startling clarity that very young children sometimes possessed. I want my family to stay together. I want Miss Rebecca to be our mama now, 'cause she gives good hugs and she don't cry when baby Catherine screams. The courtroom fell silent as Mary's simple words cut through all the legal complexities and administrative procedures to the heart of what was actually at stake. This wasn't about financial projections or institutional capacity. It was about preserving the bonds that made these children a family rather than simply a collection of orphans requiring placement. Mrs. Abernathy made one final attempt to redirect the proceedings toward practical considerations. Your Honor, while these children's affection for Miss Matthews is touching, emotional attachment cannot override the reality of their situation. They need resources, stability, and proper educational opportunities that only established institutions can provide. But Judge Harrison had clearly been affected by the children's testimony, and his next words shifted the entire dynamic of the proceedings. Mrs. Abernathy, I appreciate the territorial authorities' concern for these children's welfare. However, I'm not convinced that institutional placement serves their best interests when they have a potential guardian willing to assume responsibility for their care. Rebecca felt hope surge through her chest, but the judge wasn't finished with his assessment. Miss Matthews, I'm prepared to grant temporary guardianship for a period of 6 months, during which time you'll need to demonstrate your ability to provide proper care and address the ranch's financial obligations. If you can prove the viability of keeping this family together, I'll consider permanent guardianship. The conditional approval was both victory and challenge. Rebecca had won the right to try, but she'd also committed herself to proving the impossible within an impossibly short time frame. As the courthouse proceedings concluded, and the children surrounded her with tears of relief and joy, Rebecca understood that the real battle was just beginning. She had 6 months to save a ranch, support 9 children, and prove that love and determination could triumph over mathematical impossibility. But looking at the faces surrounding her, hopeful, trusting, grateful, Rebecca knew she would spend every day of those 6 months fighting for the right to call them her family. The ride back to the ranch felt different than Rebecca's first journey down that rutted road. Then she'd been a stranger heading into uncertainty. Now, she was the legal guardian of 9 children, carrying the weight of responsibilities that would have staggered most experienced adults. The temporary nature of Judge Harrison's ruling meant she had exactly 180 days to prove that her determination could overcome financial reality. The children's chatter filled the borrowed wagon as they processed their victory at the courthouse. Tommy regaled his siblings with dramatic reenactments of Mrs. Abernathy's stern expressions, while the twins peppered Rebecca with questions about what being a real mama would mean for their daily routines. Only Sarah remained quiet, her 11-year-old, wisdom recognizing that today's legal victory was merely permission to attempt the impossible. "Miss Rebecca," Sarah said quietly as the ranch buildings came into view, "what are we going to do about the bank payment tomorrow?" The question cut through the children's celebration like a knife through silk. Rebecca had been so focused on winning guardianship that she'd temporarily forgotten the immediate crisis that could render her victory meaningless. $15 by tomorrow or everything she'd just fought for would be lost to foreclosure. "I have a few ideas," Rebecca replied, projecting confidence she didn't feel. In truth, she had exactly $3.47 in her purse, the remainder of her travel money from Philadelphia. Even if she sold every possession she owned, she couldn't generate $15 by morning. That evening, after settling the children for the night, Rebecca sat at Samuel's kitchen table with paper and pencil, attempting to perform financial miracles through arithmetic. She calculated the value of the ranch's remaining livestock, the potential income from egg sales, the possibility of taking in laundry or sewing from neighboring families. Every scenario she devised fell far short of the monthly payments required. To satisfy the bank's demands, the sound of approaching horses interrupted her calculations. Through the kitchen window, she could see lanterns bobbing in the darkness as a group of riders approached the house. Rebecca's heart clenched with fear that Mrs. Abernathy had somehow arranged for the children's immediate removal despite Judge Harrison's ruling, but the voices outside carried the familiar accents of local residents rather than territorial officials. Rebecca opened the door to find Dr. Williams dismounting from his horse, followed by Mrs. Johnson, the station master who'd met her arrival, and several other townspeople she recognized from the courthouse gathering. "Evening, Miss Matthews," Dr. Williams said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Hope you don't mind the late visit, but we wanted to speak with you about the children's situation." Rebecca invited them inside, noting how the adults' eyes automatically surveyed the house for signs of the children's welfare. She was grateful that Sarah had managed to maintain reasonable order despite the day's emotional upheaval. Dishes washed, floors swept, evidence that the family functioned as a cohesive unit rather than a collection of neglected orphans. "Miss Matthews," Mrs. Johnson began, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. "We heard about the bank payment due tomorrow. $15 might not sound like much to city folk, but in these parts, it represents a considerable sum." "We also heard," added Tom Fletcher, a rancher whose property bordered the Whitmore land, "that you are committed to keeping these children together. That takes courage, especially for someone who doesn't know our ways." Rebecca braced herself. For well-meaning advice about the impossibility of her situation, perhaps offers to take 1 or 2 of the younger children to ease her burden. Instead, Dr. Williams reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "Miss Matthews, the people of Cedar Valley took up a collection this afternoon. It's not charity, mind you. It's an investment in keeping a family together. We've all seen what happens when children get scattered to institutions. Most never find their way back to each other. The pouch contained exactly $15.50, mostly in coins and small bills that spoke of individual sacrifices rather than casual generosity. Rebecca stared at the money with tears threatening to overflow, understanding that this gift represented far more than financial assistance. It was the community's vote of confidence in her guardianship. "I don't know how to thank you," Rebecca whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You can thank us by proving Mrs. Abernathy wrong," Tom Fletcher replied with a slight smile. "Show the territorial authorities that families belong together, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they work together." But Mrs. Johnson wasn't finished with their evening's business. "Miss Matthews, $15 solves tomorrow's crisis, but you'll face the same problem next month and the month after that. We've been discussing possible solutions to the ranch's long-term financial difficulties." Dr. Williams nodded agreement. "This community has watched the Whitmore Ranch struggle since Samuel took sick. The land is good, the location excellent, but it needs investment and experience management to reach its potential." "What are you proposing?" Rebecca asked, sensing that their visit involved more than simple charity. Tom Fletcher leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped on the kitchen table. "Miss Matthews, I've been ranching in this valley for 20 years. I know cattle, land management, crop rotation, all the skills you'll need to make this place profitable. I'm willing to teach you, help you rebuild the herd, maybe even provide some breeding stock on extended credit." Mrs. Johnson's contribution proved equally practical. "I've been thinking about the educational aspects of your situation. 9 children need proper schooling, but the nearest school is 8 miles away. What if you established a small school right here on the ranch? Other families in the valley would pay for their children's education, especially if the teacher was someone with real learning from back east." The suggestions began flowing faster as the group warmed to their collaborative problem-solving. Dr. Williams offered to provide medical care for the children in exchange for Rebecca teaching his own daughter advanced mathematics and literature. The station master mentioned that the railroad was seeking local suppliers for fresh eggs and produce to feed work crews maintaining the line. Within 2 hours, Rebecca found herself at the center of an informal business consortium with community members offering skills, resources, and markets that could transform the failing ranch into a viable enterprise. The financial projections remained challenging, but for the first time since her arrival, success seemed mathematically possible rather than merely hoped for. After the visitors departed, Rebecca sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the $15 that would save tomorrow and the list of commitments that might save their future. The weight of community expectation felt both encouraging and terrifying. She was no longer fighting alone, but she was also accountable to people who'd invested their own resources in her success. The next morning brought the first test of her new support network. Rebecca rode into town with Tommy and Sarah, the bank payment secure in her purse, but her stomach churning with anxiety about Mr. Peterson's reaction to her guardianship victory. The banker's office felt different now that Rebecca possessed legal authority rather than desperate hope. Peterson greeted her with professional courtesy, though his expression suggested continued skepticism about her long-term prospects. "Miss Matthews, I understand congratulations are in order regarding your guardianship approval. Judge Harrison's decision was unexpected, given the territorial authorities' recommendations." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I'm here to make the November payment and discuss possible modifications to the loan terms." Peterson's eyebrows rose with interest as Rebecca counted out $15.50, the extra 50 cents representing her commitment to staying ahead of their obligations rather than merely meeting them. "Miss Matthews, I must admit, surprise at your ability to generate this payment so quickly. May I ask about your income sources?" Rebecca had anticipated this question and prepared her response carefully. I'm establishing a small school on the ranch property, which will provide regular income. Additionally, I'm working with neighboring ranchers to rebuild the cattle operation and develop markets for agricultural products. She outlined the business plan that had emerged from the previous evening's discussion, emphasizing community partnerships and diversified income streams. Peterson listened with the careful attention of someone evaluating a serious proposal rather than dismissing it as wishful thinking. Miss Matthews, your planning appears more thorough than I initially expected. However, the bank's concern remains the substantial principal balance. Even with regular monthly payments, this loan would require nearly 6 years to satisfy completely, which is why I'd like to discuss acceleration options, Rebecca replied, producing the notes she'd made during her sleepless night of calculations. If the ranch generates surplus income beyond operating expenses, I'd like to apply those funds toward principal reduction. Peterson studied her figures with growing interest. The projections were optimistic, but not unrealistic, based on actual market conditions and confirmed community support rather than hopeful speculation. Miss Matthews, I'm willing to work with you on this arrangement, with one condition. You'll need to provide quarterly reports demonstrating progress toward your financial goals. If the ranch falls significantly behind projections, the bank reserves the right to accelerate foreclosure proceedings. Rebecca accepted the terms, understanding that Peterson was offering her a genuine opportunity while protecting the bank's interests. The quarterly reporting requirement meant she'd face regular scrutiny, but it also provided a framework for demonstrating progress toward financial stability. As they prepared to leave the bank, Tommy tugged on Rebecca's sleeve with obvious excitement. Miss Rebecca, does this mean we get to keep the ranch? Does this mean we're really going to be a family? Rebecca knelt to meet his 8-year-old eyes, seeing hope and fear warring in his expression. Tommy, it means we have a chance to prove that families belong together, but it also means we all have to work very hard to make this dream come true. The boy's response revealed wisdom beyond his years. Miss Rebecca, we've been working hard our whole lives. Now we just get to work hard for something that belongs to us. On the ride back to the ranch, Sarah finally voiced the question that had been weighing on her since the courthouse victory. Miss Rebecca, what happens if we can't make it work? What happens if 6 months isn't enough time? Rebecca considered her response carefully, understanding that false optimism would serve no one. Sarah, I can't promise that everything will work perfectly, but I can promise that we'll face whatever challenges come together as a family, and sometimes that's enough to make impossible things possible. As the ranch buildings came into view, Rebecca could see the other children playing in the yard while Michael tended to chores with newfound enthusiasm. Baby Catherine waved from Emma's arms, her innocent joy providing a reminder of what they were all fighting to preserve. The next 6 months would test every aspect of Rebecca's determination, resourcefulness, and capacity for love. She would need to master skills she'd never imagined learning, navigate challenges that would defeat many experienced adults, and prove that ordinary people could indeed accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept defeat. But looking at the faces of the children who now called her Mama, Rebecca understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. She had been given 6 months to perform a miracle, and she intended to use every day of that time to prove that love, determination, and community support could overcome any obstacle. The impossible had become merely difficult, and Rebecca Matthews was ready for the fight of her life. December arrived with the brutal honesty of a Nebraska winter, testing every optimistic plan Rebecca had made during the warmer days of November. The small schoolhouse she'd established in the ranch's former storage building now served 8 local children in addition to her own, but heating the drafty structure consumed precious fuel that strained their already tight budget. The income from tuition helped with monthly expenses, but fell short of the robust profits she'd projected during those hopeful conversations with community supporters. The morning Rebecca dreaded most came on a crystalline Tuesday when the thermometer outside the kitchen window read 12 degrees below zero. Tom Fletcher's promised cattle mentorship had progressed well during the autumn months, but winter had revealed the harsh reality that cattle required expensive feed when prairie grass lay buried under 3 feet of snow. "Miss Rebecca," Michael called from the barn, his voice carrying the edge of panic that had become too familiar in recent weeks. "Bessie's down again, and I think something's wrong with her calf." Rebecca pulled on Samuel's oversized coat and followed Michael through snow that crunched under their feet like broken glass. Inside the barn, their prize milk cow lay on her side, breathing heavily, while her week-old calf stood nearby on shaking legs. Dr. Williams had taught Rebecca basic veterinary skills during his regular visits, but Bessie's condition was beyond her limited knowledge. The cow's labored breathing and distended abdomen suggested serious complications that could cost them not only their primary source of milk, but also the calf that represented next spring's hope for herd expansion. "Tommy, ride to Dr. Williams' place as fast as you can," Rebecca instructed, trying to keep fear from her voice. "Tell him it's urgent." As Tommy raced through the snow on their aging mare, Rebecca knelt beside Bessie, stroking the cow's neck, while her mind calculated the financial implications of losing their most valuable animal. The veterinary bill would consume most of their emergency fund, assuming Dr. Williams could even save Bessie's life. Sarah appeared in the barn doorway, baby Catherine bundled against her chest, while the other children clustered behind her with wide, frightened eyes. "Is Bessie going to die?" Emma asked with the directness that 4-year-olds brought to life's most difficult questions. Rebecca met the child's gaze honestly. "I don't know, sweetheart, but Dr. Williams is very good with animals, and we're going to do everything we can to help her." The next 3 hours tested Rebecca's nerves as thoroughly as any crisis she'd faced since arriving in Nebraska. Dr. Williams worked with quiet efficiency, his experienced hands examining Bessie while he explained the cow's condition in terms Rebecca could understand. "She's got what we call milk fever," he said, preparing a syringe with medication. "Fairly common in dairy cows after calving, but it can be fatal if not treated properly. The good news is we caught it early. The bad news is she'll need expensive treatment and special care for the next several weeks." Rebecca's heart sank as Dr. Williams outlined the required care regimen: special feed, regular medication, constant monitoring, expenses that would consume their carefully budgeted resources and require attention that would interfere with the school schedule and other ranch duties. "Dr. Williams, what would this treatment cost?" Rebecca asked, dreading the answer. The physician's expression showed understanding of her financial constraints. "Under normal circumstances, about $25 for medication and special feed. But Miss Rebecca, we might be able to work out some kind of arrangement." Before he could elaborate, the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention to the barn entrance. Tom Fletcher dismounted from his gelding, followed by Mrs. Johnson and 3 other neighbors whose faces showed concern rather than casual social visiting. "Tommy said you had trouble with Bessie," Tom announced without preamble. "Thought you might need some help." Rebecca felt tears threatening as she realized the true meaning of community support. These people hadn't just offered advice and encouragement, they were prepared to share in the practical burdens that could destroy everything she'd built. Mrs. Johnson examined the sick cow with the expertise of someone who'd raised livestock for decades. "Dr. Williams, what's your assessment? Treatable but expensive, the physician replied honestly. Miss Rebecca's looking at significant costs for medication and feed. Tom Fletcher reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small cloth bag. Miss Rebecca, this community invested in your success 6 months ago. We're not about to let a sick cow undo everything you've accomplished. The bag contained nearly $30 in coins and bills, collected from neighbors who understood that Rebecca's failure would affect the entire valley's faith in community cooperation. But more importantly, Mrs. Johnson began organizing a care schedule that would distribute Bessie's treatment among experienced neighbors. Tom can handle the morning medications before his own chores, Mrs. Johnson announced, with the authority of someone accustomed to solving practical problems. I'll take afternoon treatments, and my oldest boy can help with the special feeding schedule. Rebecca watched this coordination of community resources with amazement and gratitude. These people weren't just helping her save a cow, they were demonstrating that her family's success had become a shared responsibility rather than an individual struggle. Dr. Williams accepted the community's payment arrangement with obvious approval. Miss Rebecca, this kind of cooperation is what makes frontier communities survive and thrive. You're not just saving a ranch, you're proving that people can accomplish more together than any individual could manage alone. As the crisis meeting dispersed and neighbors departed to handle their own evening chores, Rebecca found herself alone in the barn with Bessie, who was already showing improvement from Dr. Williams's treatment. The cow's breathing had stabilized, and her calf nursed contentedly for the first time since morning. But Rebecca's relief was tempered by a growing awareness of how completely her family's welfare depended on community goodwill. The money for Bessie's treatment, the labor for special care, the emotional support during crisis, all of it represented gifts that created obligations she might not be able to repay. That evening, as the children completed their homework by lamplight, Sarah approached Rebecca with the serious expression that always preceded important conversations. Miss Rebecca, I've been thinking about what happened today with Bessie and all the neighbors helping us. It was wonderful, wasn't it? Rebecca replied, expecting Sarah to share her gratitude for community support. Instead, Sarah's response revealed concerns that Rebecca hadn't anticipated. It was wonderful, but it also made me worry. What happens when people get tired of helping us? What happens when they have their own troubles and can't spare time or money for our problems? The 11-year-old's question cut to the heart of Rebecca's own growing anxieties. Community support had been generous and consistent, but it was also essentially charitable, dependent on neighbors' continued goodwill rather than sustainable business relationships. Sarah, that's exactly why we need to work so hard to make the ranch successful on its own, Rebecca replied. The goal is to become contributors to the community rather than people who always need help. But even as she spoke these optimistic words, Rebecca recognized the mathematical reality of their situation. 3 months into her 6-month trial period, the ranch was surviving but not thriving. School tuition covered basic expenses, but didn't generate surplus for ranch improvements or debt reduction. The cattle operation remained dependent on Tom Fletcher's expertise and resources. Even their daily meals relied on Mrs. Johnson's generous trading arrangements. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who would challenge Rebecca's understanding of what success actually meant. Mrs. Abernathy's carriage appeared in the ranch yard just as Rebecca was preparing breakfast, the territorial official's presence immediately creating tension among the children. "Miss Matthews," Mrs. Abernathy announced without accepting Rebecca's invitation to come inside, "I'm here for my quarterly assessment of the children's welfare and your progress toward financial stability." Rebecca had been dreading this visit. Since Judge Harrison granted her guardianship, Mrs. Abernathy possessed the authority to recommend termination of the arrangement if she found evidence of inadequate care or financial instability. Of course, Mrs. Abernathy. The children are healthy and well educated, and we've met all our financial obligations to the bank. Mrs. Abernathy's inspection proved thorough and intimidating. She examined the children's sleeping arrangements, questioned them about their meals and education, reviewed Rebecca's financial records with the skeptical attention of someone seeking evidence of failure. Miss Matthews, while the children appear adequately cared for, I have concerns about the sustainability of your arrangements. Your financial records show heavy dependence on community charity rather than genuine self-sufficiency. Rebecca felt her carefully constructed confidence beginning to crumble under Mrs. Abernathy's clinical assessment. Mrs. Abernathy, we've developed strong community partnerships that provide mutual benefit rather than one-sided charity. Miss Matthews, partnerships imply equal exchange of value. What I see here is a pattern of community members providing resources while you contribute little beyond good intentions and domestic labor. The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth. Rebecca had indeed received far more from the community than she'd been able to provide in return. Her teaching generated modest income, but nothing approaching the value of the assistance she'd received. Mrs. Abernathy's interview with the children proved even more challenging. While their obvious affection for Rebecca was clear, several questions revealed ongoing concerns about their situation's stability. "Tommy, do you ever worry about having enough food?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, with the deceptive gentleness of someone skilled at extracting uncomfortable truths. Tommy's 8-year-old honesty proved devastating. "Sometimes, especially when Bessie was sick and we didn't have much milk. But Miss Rebecca always makes sure the little ones eat first." "Sarah, do you feel responsible for helping care for your younger siblings?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied carefully. "But Miss Rebecca does most of the work now. I just help with things like braiding hair and teaching letters." Each answer revealed the children's awareness of their precarious circumstances, despite Rebecca's efforts to shield them from adult anxieties. Mrs. Abernathy's questions were designed to demonstrate that the children remained vulnerable to the same uncertainties that had characterized their lives before Rebecca's arrival. After completing her assessment, Mrs. Abernathy delivered her preliminary conclusions with bureaucratic efficiency. "Miss Matthews, while I acknowledge your sincere efforts and the children's obvious attachment to you, I remain concerned about the long-term viability of this arrangement. You have 3 months remaining to demonstrate genuine financial stability and reduce dependence on community charity." As Mrs. Abernathy's carriage disappeared down the snow-covered road, Rebecca felt the weight of impossible expectations settling on her shoulders like lead blankets. She had 90 days to transform a struggling ranch into a profitable enterprise, prove her worthiness as a guardian to 9 children, and justify the community's investment in her success. That evening, as she tucked Mary into bed and listened to the 3-year-old's prayers for Mama Rebecca and all our family, Rebecca understood that the next 3 months would determine not just her own future, but the fate of 9 children who'd already lost too much. The winter wind howled around the house with the voice of challenges yet to come, but inside, 9 children slept peacefully under the protection of someone who refused to let them face an uncertain world alone. Whether Rebecca Matthews possessed the strength and resources to honor that protection remained to be seen, but her determination had only grown stronger in the face of Mrs. Abernathy's skepticism. Sometimes the greatest victories were won not through perfect planning, but through absolute refusal to accept defeat. February brought the kind of cold that made breathing feel like swallowing knives, and with it came the crisis that would either destroy everything Rebecca had built or forge it into something unbreakable. The morning started ordinarily enough. Children bundled against the cold as they made their way to the makeshift schoolhouse, Bessie recovered and producing milk again, the daily routines that had become their anchor against uncertainty. But by midday, everything changed with the arrival of a telegram that would shake the foundation of their carefully constructed world. The messenger, a young man from the railroad office, rode through snow drifts that reached his horse's belly to deliver the yellow envelope that seemed to burn in Rebecca's hands. Telegrams in frontier communities rarely brought good news, and this one proved no exception to that rule. Philadelphia textile mill fire, stop. Margaret Collins. Deceased. Stop. Children need immediate placement. Stop arriving. Cedar Valley. March 1st. Stop. Thomas Wellington Territorial Authority. Rebecca read the telegram 3 times before its full implications penetrated her shock. Margaret Collins had been Rebecca's closest friend in Philadelphia, a widow with 4 young children who'd remained behind when Rebecca answered Samuel's advertisement. Now Margaret was dead, and her children, aged 3 to 12, would arrive in Cedar Valley within 2 weeks, expecting care that Rebecca had no legal authority to provide and no resources to support. Sarah, who'd been helping with afternoon lessons when the telegram arrived, read Rebecca's expression with the uncomfortable accuracy of someone who'd learned to anticipate adult crises. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked quietly, moving to position herself between Rebecca and the younger children who were still absorbed in their arithmetic exercises. Rebecca showed Sarah the telegram, watching the 11-year-old's face pale as she absorbed the magnitude of this new challenge. 4 more children would mean 13 mouths to feed, 13 bodies to clothe and shelter, 13 reasons why their already precarious situation would become mathematically impossible. "Miss Rebecca," Sarah whispered, "we can't take care of 4 more children. We barely manage with what we have now." The brutal honesty of Sarah's assessment cut through Rebecca's emotional turmoil with surgical precision. The girl was absolutely right. They lacked space, resources, and legal authority to assume responsibility for Margaret's orphaned children. But the alternative was allowing 4 children who'd lost their mother to be placed in institutions, separated from each other and from any connection to the life they'd known. That evening, after settling her own children for the night, Rebecca sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, attempting to perform miracles through mathematics. No matter how she calculated space, food, and finances, the numbers refused to add up to anything resembling possibility. The house could accommodate 4 additional children only if they were willing to live in conditions that bordered on dangerous. Overcrowding. Food costs would increase beyond what their current income could support. Most critically, Thomas Wellington's authority as territorial representative meant he could override local decisions about the children's placement. Rebecca was still wrestling with impossible calculations when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the front windows. Tom Fletcher dismounted from his horse, followed by Dr. Williams and Mrs. Johnson, their faces showing the grim determination of people arriving to deliver difficult news. "Miss Rebecca," Tom began without preamble as they settled around the kitchen table. "We heard about the telegram. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when it involves children needing help." Rebecca felt a familiar mixture of gratitude and apprehension. These people had supported her through every previous crisis, but this challenge exceeded anything they'd faced before. "Tom, I appreciate your concern, but this situation is different. 4 additional children would strain our resources beyond any reasonable limit." Dr. Williams leaned forward, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. "Miss Rebecca, we've been discussing this among ourselves and we think you're looking at the problem from the wrong angle." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Johnson took charge of the explanation with her characteristic directness. "You've been thinking about how to care for 13 children with your current resources. But what if we approach this as an opportunity to expand the operation, rather than just accommodate more children? Rebecca stared at them, uncertain whether they were offering genuine solutions or simply refusing to acknowledge reality. Mrs. Johnson, I don't understand how adding 4 children could possibly be seen as an opportunity. Tom Fletcher pulled out a folded paper covered with calculations and rough sketches. Miss Rebecca, we've been watching your school operation for 3 months now. You're teaching 8 local children plus your own 9, and the results have been remarkable. Parents are talking about the quality of education their children are receiving. But more children means more work, more expense, more tuition, Dr. Williams interrupted gently. Miss Rebecca, there are at least a dozen families in this valley who would pay premium rates for quality education. What if we expanded the school to accommodate 20 or 30 students? Mrs. Johnson nodded enthusiastically. And what if we formalized the arrangement? Instead of operating out of a converted storage building, what if we built a proper schoolhouse that could serve the entire valley? Rebecca felt her mind reeling as they outlined their vision. A real school building, expanded enrollment, formalized curriculum. It was ambitious beyond anything she dared imagine, but it was also terrifyingly dependent on assumptions about community support and her own capabilities. Even if such a school were possible, Rebecca said carefully, it wouldn't solve the immediate problem of housing and feeding 4 additional children. They arrive in 2 weeks, not 2 years. Tom Fletcher's response revealed the depth of planning that had gone into their evening visit. Miss Rebecca, my wife and I have been discussing this since we heard about the telegram. We're prepared to house Margaret's children temporarily, while construction begins on expanded facilities here. Construction? Dr. Williams smiled at her obvious confusion. Miss Rebecca, this community has invested too much in your success to let it fail because of a housing shortage. We're talking about adding rooms to the main house, building a proper dormitory for older children, creating facilities that could serve as a model for other frontier communities. The scope of their proposal left Rebecca speechless. They were discussing investments of hundreds of dollars, months of construction work, fundamental changes to the ranch's purpose and operation. It was generous beyond imagination, but it was also precisely the kind of charity dependence that Mrs. Abernathy had criticized during her assessment. I can't ask the community to bear such enormous costs for my personal obligations, Rebecca said quietly. Mrs. Johnson's response carried the authority of someone who'd thought through every objection. Miss Rebecca, you're not asking us to bear costs. You're allowing us to invest in something that benefits everyone. A quality school serves the entire valley's children. Improve facilities, increase property values throughout the region. Your success demonstrates that frontier communities can solve their own problems through cooperation. As the 3 visitors outlined their plans in greater detail, Rebecca began to understand that their proposal represented more than simple charity. They were offering to transform her individual struggle into a community enterprise that would serve multiple families while establishing the Whitmore Ranch as a regional center for education and child welfare. But even as excitement built around the possibilities they described, practical concerns pressed against Rebecca's growing optimism. Thomas Wellington would arrive in 2 weeks with 4 children and the authority to place them wherever he deemed appropriate. Construction projects required months to complete. The gap between vision and reality remained as wide as ever. What about the immediate situation? Rebecca asked. Mr. Wellington arrives March 1st with 4 children who need immediate placement. Even if we begin construction tomorrow, we won't have expanded facilities for months. Tom Fletcher's expression grew serious as he addressed this concern. Miss Rebecca, that's where we need to discuss some uncomfortable realities about territorial Authority and community resistance. Dr. Williams nodded gravely. Thomas Wellington has the legal right to place Margaret's children wherever he chooses, but he doesn't have the practical ability to force unwilling communities to accept his decisions. What are you suggesting? Mrs. Johnson's response carried implications that made Rebecca's stomach clench with anxiety. We're suggesting that this community has the right to determine what's best for children within our boundaries. If we collectively agree that Margaret's children belong here with you, Mr. Wellington will find it difficult to impose alternative arrangements. Rebecca understood the subtext of their suggestion. They were proposing community resistance to territorial authority, a confrontation that could have serious legal and political consequences for everyone involved. Mrs. Johnson, are you talking about defying territorial officials? That could result in serious consequences for all of you. Tom Fletcher's smile carried the grim humor of someone who'd faced down authority before. Miss Rebecca, sometimes communities have to stand up for what's right, regardless of what some bureaucrat in Omaha thinks is proper. We've seen what institutional placement does to children. We're not willing to let it happen to Margaret's little ones if we can prevent it. As the evening progressed, Rebecca found herself at the center of a conspiracy that was both inspiring and terrifying. The community was prepared to expand her operation dramatically, invest significant resources in new construction, and even defy territorial authority to keep Margaret's children together with her family. But it was also a commitment that would transform her from a struggling individual guardian into the focal point of a community enterprise that could affect dozens of families throughout the valley. Success would benefit everyone involved, but failure would devastate far more than just her own family. After her visitors departed, Rebecca stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the snow-covered yard where 13 children might soon be playing together. The vision was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a chance to create something unprecedented in frontier child welfare, but also a responsibility that could crush her if she proved unequal to its demands. Tomorrow, she would need to make decisions that would determine not just the fate of Margaret's 4 orphaned children, but the future of her own family and the community that had invested so much faith in her success. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. Like the Nebraska winter itself, cold, relentless, and impossible to escape. But somewhere in the darkness, Rebecca felt the stirring of determination that had carried her through every previous crisis. She'd come west seeking personal salvation and found herself at the center of something far larger and more important. Whether she possessed the strength to honor that calling remained to be seen, but she was no longer facing the challenge alone. In 2 weeks, Thomas Wellington would arrive with 4 children who needed more than institutional placement. They needed family, community, and the chance to heal from their mother's death. Rebecca Matthews intended to be ready for that challenge, whatever the cost to herself. The impossible had become merely difficult once again, and Rebecca was prepared to fight for the right to call it possible. March first arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made Nebraska's endless sky seem like a promise of better days ahead. Rebecca stood on the front porch of what had once been Samuel Whitmore's modest ranch house, but was now something unprecedented in frontier child welfare, a thriving center of education and family preservation that had exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. The transformation had begun the morning after the community meeting about Margaret's children. Tom Fletcher arrived at dawn with a wagon full of lumber and 3 neighboring ranchers who'd volunteered their labor. Mrs. Johnson appeared with architectural sketches drawn by her brother, a carpenter from Lincoln. Dr. Williams brought surveying, tools, and the kind of methodical planning that had made him successful in both medicine and business. Within 2 weeks, they'd accomplished what should have taken months. An addition to the main house provided sleeping quarters for 6 additional children, while a separate dormitory building could accommodate 8 more in comfortable, supervised conditions. The original storage building had been transformed into a proper classroom with slate boards, individual desks, and a small library donated by families throughout the valley. But the physical transformation was only part of what had occurred. The Whitmore Academy, as it had come to be known, now served 28 students from families across 3 counties. Parents paid tuition rates that reflected the quality of education their children received, creating income streams that not only supported the expanded operation, but generated surplus for debt reduction and facility improvements. More importantly, the academy had become a model for community-based child welfare that was attracting attention from territorial authorities and educational reformers throughout the region. Judge Harrison had visited twice, bringing officials from Omaha who were studying the Whitmore model for potential replication in other frontier communities. As Rebecca watched the road for signs of Thomas Wellington's arrival, she reflected on how completely her life had been transformed in just 4 months. She'd arrived in Cedar Valley as a desperate woman fleeing poverty, seeking personal salvation through marriage to a stranger. Now she was the director of an educational institution, legal guardian to 13 children, and the focal point of a community enterprise that was reshaping how frontier families thought about cooperation and mutual support. The sound of approaching wagons drew her attention to the main road, where a small convoy was raising dust clouds against the clear morning sky. Thomas Wellington had arrived with Margaret's 4 children, but he wasn't alone. 2 additional wagons carried territorial officials, whose presence suggested this visit involved more than simple child placement. Rebecca gathered her children around her as the convoy approached, understanding that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of Margaret's orphans, but the future of everything they'd built together. Sarah held baby Catherine, who was now walking and chattering constantly. Tommy and Michael flanked Rebecca with the protective instincts of young men who understood they were defending their family. The twins clung to each other, while David, Emma, and Mary arranged themselves in a defensive formation that spoke of children who'd learned not to trust authority figures. Thomas Wellington proved to be a thin man in his 50s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his days behind a desk and the nervous energy of someone uncomfortable with practical frontier realities. He climbed down from his wagon with obvious reluctance, surveying the ranch's transformed facilities with expressions that mixed surprise and suspicion. "Miss Matthews," Wellington began formally, "I'm here to assess placement options for the Collins children and to investigate reports of irregular child welfare arrangements at this location." Rebecca felt her stomach clench at the official tone of his statement. Wellington wasn't just delivering Margaret's children. He was conducting an investigation that could result in the removal of all 13 children from her care. "Mr. Wellington, welcome to the Whitmore Academy. I'm prepared to discuss placement arrangements for the Collins children, and I'd be happy to show you our educational and residential facilities." Before Wellington could respond, one of the other officials stepped forward, a woman in her 40s whose bearing suggested significant authority within territorial administration. "Miss Matthews, I'm Eleanor Harrison, Director of Territorial Child Welfare Services. I'm here to evaluate reports that this community has been operating outside established guidelines for institutional child care." Rebecca's heart sank as she recognized the implications of Eleanor Harrison's presence. This wasn't a routine placement visit. It was a formal investigation that could result in the closure of the academy and removal of all children to distant institutions. But before she could respond, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention to the main road. A procession of wagons, buggies, and riders was converging on the ranch, carrying what appeared to be half the population of Cedar Valley and surrounding communities. Tom Fletcher led the cavalcade, followed by Dr. Williams, Mrs. Johnson, and dozens of other families whose children attended the academy or who had supported its development. They arranged themselves in a respectful but unmistakably protective formation around the ranch buildings, creating a human barrier between the territorial officials and the children they'd come to investigate. Judge Harrison's arrival in his official buggy added legal authority to the community gathering. The judge climbed down with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to presiding over important proceedings, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic from administrative investigation to formal judicial review. Mr. Wellington, Mrs. Harrison. Judge Harrison began with quiet authority. I understand you're here to investigate child welfare arrangements at the Whitmore Academy. As the local judicial authority responsible for guardianship proceedings in this county, I'd like to participate in your assessment. Eleanor Harrison's expression showed obvious discomfort with the unexpected scope of community involvement in what she'd planned as a routine administrative action. Judge Harrison, while we appreciate local cooperation, territorial authority supersedes county jurisdiction in matters of child welfare policy. Judge Harrison's smile carried the patient confidence of someone who'd researched legal precedents thoroughly. Mrs. Harrison, territorial authority extends to policy formation and resource allocation, but specific placement decisions remain within local judicial discretion, particularly when those decisions involve established guardianship arrangements that have proven successful. As the territorial officials absorbed the implications of Judge Harrison's legal position, Margaret's 4 children emerged from Wellington's wagon with the shell-shocked expressions of children who'd experienced too much loss and uncertainty. Rebecca's heart broke as she recognized their emotional state, frightened, confused, desperately hoping for stability while fearing another devastating disappointment. The oldest, a girl of 12 named Patricia, held the hand of her youngest sibling, a 3-year-old boy who clutched a ragged stuffed rabbit with the desperation of someone clinging to his last connection to everything familiar. Between them, 2 boys aged 7 and 9 surveyed their surroundings with the wary alertness of children who'd learned to expect the worst from adult decisions. Rebecca knelt to meet Patricia's eyes, recognizing the premature maturity that came from caring for younger siblings through family crisis. Patricia, I'm Rebecca Matthews. I was your mother's friend in Philadelphia, and I'd like to take care of you and your brothers if you'll let me. The girl's response revealed wisdom far beyond her 12 years. Miss Matthews, Mama told us about you in her letters. She said you were brave enough to start over when everything seemed hopeless. Are you brave enough to take care of 4 more children when you already have so many? The question cut to the heart of everything Rebecca had been wrestling with since. Receiving Wellington's telegram, was she taking on more than she could handle? Was she risking the stability of 9 children for the sake of 4 more? But looking at Patricia's frightened courage, at the 3-year-old who'd already lost too much, at the boys who were trying so hard to be brave, Rebecca understood that some decisions transcended practical calculations. Patricia, I don't know if I'm brave enough, but I'm willing to try. And I'm not trying alone. This whole community is committed to making sure all 13 of you have the chance to grow up together, safe and loved. Eleanor Harrison stepped forward with the bureaucratic efficiency of someone accustomed to overriding local sentiment. Miss Matthews, while your intentions are admirable, territorial policy requires that we evaluate multiple placement options. For these children, concentrating 13 orphans in a single location creates risks that established institutions are better equipped to manage. Before Rebecca could respond, Sarah stepped forward with the quiet dignity of someone who'd found her voice through months of security and encouragement. Mrs. Harrison, I'm Sarah Whitmore. I've been taking care of my brothers and sisters since our parents died, and Miss Rebecca has been taking care of all of us since she came here. We're not just orphans who got put together by accident. We're a family who chose each other. Tommy joined his sister with the earnest determination of an 8-year-old who understood he was fighting for everything that mattered. Mrs. Harrison, we learn more here than kids in regular schools. We take care of each other, we work together, and we're happy. Isn't that what families are supposed to do? One by one, Rebecca's children stepped forward to address the territorial officials, their testimonies revealing the depth of transformation that had occurred since her arrival. They spoke about feeling safe for the first time since their parents' deaths, about educational opportunities that exceeded anything available in institutional settings, about belonging to something larger than themselves. But it was Mary now, 4 years old, who provided the most compelling testimony. She approached Eleanor Harrison with the fearless directness that very young children sometimes possessed. "Lady, are you going to take our family away?" Eleanor Harrison knelt to meet Mary's eyes, her bureaucratic composure cracking slightly in the face of such innocent directness. "Sweetheart, we want to make sure all children get the best care possible." "But this is the best care," Mary replied with devastating simplicity. "Mama Rebecca hugs us when we're scared and teaches us letters and makes sure baby Catherine doesn't cry. Why would you want to change that?" As Mary's words hung in the air, Dr. Williams stepped forward with the authority of someone who'd witnessed the Academy's development from its desperate beginnings to its current success. "Mrs. Harrison, I've been monitoring the health and welfare of these children since Miss Matthews arrived 6 months ago. They've shown remarkable improvement in every measurable category: nutrition, education, emotional stability, social development. The Whitmore Academy isn't just succeeding, it's establishing new standards for community-based child welfare." Tom Fletcher nodded agreement, producing a folder of documents that represented months of careful record-keeping. "Mrs. Harrison, these financial records show that the Academy is completely self-sustaining. Tuition income covers all operating expenses, debt service, and facility improvements. The children aren't a burden on territorial resources. They're contributing members of a thriving educational community." Eleanor Harrison reviewed the documents with obvious surprise. The financial records revealed an operation that not only met all its obligations, but generated surplus for expansion and improvement. More importantly, the educational assessments showed academic achievement levels that exceeded territorial standards by significant margins. Judge Harrison seized the moment to present his own legal assessment. "Mrs. Harrison, territorial law requires that placement decisions serve the best interests of the children involved. The evidence clearly demonstrates that these children are thriving under Miss Matthews' guardianship and that the community has invested substantially in their continued welfare." Wellington made one final attempt to assert territorial authority. "Judge Harrison, while local conditions may appear satisfactory, territorial policy requires that we consider standardized institutional placement for groups of this size." Patricia. Collins stepped forward with the composed determination of someone who'd found her voice through tragedy. "Mr. Wellington, I know about institutions. After Mama died, they wanted to put us in different places because we were too many to keep together. But families belong together, even when they're not related by blood. Miss Rebecca understands that. Why don't you?" The 12-year-old's question captured the fundamental issue that transcended all administrative procedures and territorial policies. The Whitmore Academy represented something unprecedented, a successful model for keeping families together through community support rather than institutional separation. Eleanor Harrison spent the next hour touring the Academy's facilities, interviewing children and community members, reviewing educational curricula and financial records. Her questions evolved from skeptical investigation to genuine inquiry about how such remarkable results had been achieved. As the afternoon progressed, Her official demeanor gradually softened into something approaching admiration. "Miss Matthews, I must admit that what you've accomplished here exceeds anything I've seen in 15 years of territorial child welfare work. These children are clearly thriving, and your educational program is remarkable. Does that mean Margaret's children can stay with us?" Rebecca asked, hardly daring to hope. Eleanor Harrison exchanged glances with Judge Harrison before responding. "Miss Matthews, I'm prepared to recommend that the Collins children be placed in your care, with the understanding that the Whitmore Academy will serve as a pilot program for community-based child welfare throughout the territory." The gathering erupted in celebration as the community realized they'd not only preserved their local achievement, but established it as a model for broader implementation. Rebecca found herself surrounded by 13 children who would now officially call her Mama, and by a community that had transformed her individual struggle into their collective triumph. As the territorial officials departed and the community, celebration continued into the evening. Rebecca stood on her front porch with baby Catherine in her arms, watching 13 children play together in the yard, where she'd first met 9 frightened orphans just 6 months earlier. She'd come to Nebraska seeking her own salvation and found something far more important: the chance to create salvation for others. The mail-order bride, who'd arrived to find no husband and no prospects, had become the guardian that 13 children had been waiting for, the teacher their community needed, and the proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to accept defeat. The straight flush that had inspired this journey belonged to another story, but the victory Rebecca had achieved was entirely her own. Love, determination, and community support had indeed triumphed over impossible circumstances, transforming 9 forgotten children and 1 desperate woman into a family that would inspire frontier communities for generations to come. As the Nebraska stars emerged in the darkening sky, Rebecca Matthews, now officially Rebecca Whitmore by choice rather than marriage, understood that she'd found exactly what she'd been searching for when she answered that first letter. Not a husband or financial security, but a purpose worthy of any sacrifice and a family worthy of any fight. The guardian they'd been waiting for had been waiting for them too, and together they'd created something beautiful from the ashes of loss and the determination never to give up on each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.